Imagine you're a young Aztec warrior, 17 years old, and you're standing on a battlefield that looks nothing like any war you've seen in the movies. There are no sieges, no one's trying to take territory, there's no land grab, no resources to capture, no king to overthrow. Instead, you're here for something way more bizarre, way more calculated, and honestly, way more terrifying. You're here to capture enemies alive, not to ransom them, not to interrogate them, not even to make them slaves in the traditional sense. You're here because your empire needs them for something else entirely. The Aztecs called these conflicts the Flower Wars, Xochiyaoyotl in their language Nahuatl, and they might be the strangest, most misunderstood military campaigns in human history. Because here's the thing that'll blow your mind. These weren't wars to win. They were wars designed specifically not to end. Welcome to the most calculated, ritualistic, and philosophically complex warfare the world has ever seen. Let's start with the basics because the term Flower Wars sounds almost poetic, right? Kind of gentle, maybe even beautiful. But don't let the name fool you. The Aztecs weren't hippies arranging flowers on battlefields. The name comes from the Nahuatl words Xochitl, meaning flower, and Yaoyotl, meaning war. In Aztec culture, warriors who fell in battle were compared to flowers, beautiful, vibrant, but destined to wilt. The battlefield was seen as a garden where these flowers bloomed and faded. It's poetic, sure, but it's also a pretty intense way to think about combat. Now, before we dive deeper, we need to understand who the Aztecs actually were and what they believed, because without that context, none of this makes any sense. The Aztec Empire, which should really be called the Mexica Empire since that's what they called themselves, dominated central Mexico from roughly 1428 to 1521. At their height, they controlled an area about the size of South Carolina, with somewhere between 5 and 6 million people under their influence. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, was one of the largest cities in the world at that time, with maybe 200,000 to 300,000 residents. To put that in perspective, that's bigger than most European cities of the era. London had maybe 50,000 people. Paris had around 100,000. Tenochtitlan was huge, sophisticated, and absolutely stunning by all accounts. The Aztecs had this incredibly complex worldview that's hard for modern minds to fully grasp. They believed the universe had been created and destroyed 4 times before. They were living in the 5th sun, the 5th world, and this world was also destined to end eventually. The gods had given their own essence to create humans, and humans owed an enormous debt to the gods. This debt had to be repaid constantly, or the sun wouldn't rise, the crops wouldn't grow, and the entire cosmos would collapse into chaos. How did they repay this debt? Through offerings, ceremonies, and yes, through providing sustenance to the gods in very specific ways. The Aztecs believed that the sun god Huitzilopochtli was in a constant battle with darkness, fighting every single day to bring light to the world. He needed strength for this battle, and that strength came from offerings provided by humans. Without these offerings, the sun would lose its battle, darkness would prevail, and the world would end. This wasn't just religious belief in the abstract sense. This was cosmic maintenance. The Aztecs genuinely believed they were preventing the apocalypse through their religious practices. Now this is where the Flower Wars come in and where things get really interesting. The Aztecs needed a steady supply of captives for their ceremonies. But here's the problem. By the mid-1400s, the Aztec Empire was incredibly successful militarily. They'd conquered most of their nearby enemies. The remaining independent states were either too far away for regular campaigns or too difficult to conquer completely. So what do you do when you need captives but you've run out of enemies to fight? You create a system of ritualized warfare. You arrange battles with other city-states where the goal isn't conquest, it's capture. And both sides agree to this arrangement because, and here's the wild part, they all share the same basic religious worldview. The Aztecs' main opponents in the Flower Wars were the city-states of the Tlaxcalan Confederation, the kingdom of Huexotzingo, and the cities of Cholula and Atlixco. These were independent states that the Aztecs could have probably conquered if they'd really wanted to, but they chose not to. Instead, they maintained them as perpetual adversaries for these arranged battles. Think of it like this. Imagine if modern countries agreed to have scheduled battles where the goal was just to take prisoners, and both sides knew about it in advance, and everyone showed up at a predetermined time and place. It sounds insane, right? But that's essentially what the Flower Wars were. They were formalized, ritualized combat with rules and expectations that both sides understood and generally followed. The first recorded Flower War happened around 1450, during the reign of the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma I, though some historians think the practice might have started earlier. The immediate trigger was actually practical. There was a massive famine in central Mexico from 1450 to 1454, caused by a combination of drought, early frosts, and locust plagues. Crops failed, people were starving, and the social order was under serious strain. The Aztec leadership needed to do something to restore confidence, to demonstrate that the gods still favored them, to show that the cosmic order was intact despite the natural disaster. Moctezuma I and his advisor Xochiyaoyotl, who was basically the power behind the throne for decades, came up with this solution. They would formalize a system of ritualized combat with nearby states. These battles would provide captives for ceremonies, keep warriors trained and sharp during peacetime, and demonstrate the empire's continued vitality and divine favor. It was brilliant from a political and religious standpoint. It addressed multiple problems at once. The Tlaxcalans and other city-states agreed to participate for their own reasons. First, they shared the same religious beliefs, so they understood the cosmic necessity of the whole thing. Second, participating in these wars gave them a chance to capture Aztec warriors, which brought prestige and religious merit to their own societies. Third, and this is crucial, by agreeing to the Flower Wars, they bought themselves a degree of independence. The Aztecs wouldn't try to conquer them completely as long as they continued to participate in these arranged battles. It was a kind of insurance policy against total conquest. So what did these battles actually look like? Well, they were scheduled in advance. Messengers would go back and forth between the Aztec capital and Tlaxcala, or whichever opponent was involved, arranging a time and place. It's like scheduling a football game, except instead of a stadium, you'd pick a designated battlefield, usually a flat plain between the two territories. Both sides would show up with their warriors, their priests, their equipment, everything prepared in advance. The warriors would be dressed in their full regalia, which was absolutely spectacular. Aztec military culture was all about intimidation and display. Warriors wore elaborate costumes made from feathers, animal skins, and cotton padding. Elite warriors, members of military orders like the Jaguar Warriors or Eagle Warriors, wore full-body costumes. Jaguar warriors dressed in jaguar pelts, complete with the head worn as a helmet. Eagle warriors wore feathered suits and helmets shaped like eagle heads. These weren't just for show. The cotton padding underneath provided genuine protection against the obsidian-bladed weapons they used. Speaking of weapons, let's talk about Aztec military technology for a second, because it's fascinating. They didn't have metal weapons. No steel, no iron, nothing like that. Their primary weapon was the Xochiyaoyotl, which was basically a wooden sword embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades. Obsidian is volcanic glass, and when it's properly worked, it can be sharper than modern surgical steel. Spanish conquistadors later reported that a skilled warrior with a Xochiyaoyotl could decapitate a horse with one swing. That's how effective these weapons were. They also used spears with obsidian points, bows and arrows, and the atlatl, which was a spear thrower that gave projectiles incredible range and power. For defense, they had shields, usually made from wood and covered with leather or feathers, and that cotton padding I mentioned, which was surprisingly effective against their weapons. But here's the thing about Flower Wars. The goal wasn't to cause casualties in the traditional sense. The goal was to capture opponents alive. This meant that warriors had to fight differently than in a conquest war. You couldn't just hack and slash your way through enemies. You had to disable them, knock them down, subdue them without causing permanent harm, and then take them prisoner. This required incredible skill and courage because you had to get close, grapple with your opponent, and overpower them while they were trying to do the same to you. Capturing an enemy was the ultimate goal for any Aztec warrior because it brought enormous prestige. Your social status, your access to privileges, your entire future could depend on how many captives you took. A young warrior who captured his first enemy earned the right to wear specific clothing and hairstyles. 4 captives and you could become a member of an elite military order. The greatest warriors, those who had captured many enemies, became minor nobility, received land grants, and were exempted from paying tribute taxes. The battles themselves were chaotic, but followed certain conventions. They usually started with a lot of noise and display. Warriors shouting, drums beating, conch shell trumpets blaring. This psychological warfare was important. You wanted to intimidate your opponents before the fighting even started. Then the 2 sides would advance toward each other, and individual combats would begin. Warriors would seek out opponents of roughly equal rank. It was considered more honorable to fight someone of your own level rather than ganging up on weaker opponents. The fighting was intense and brutal. Men would grapple, strike, wrestle, doing whatever it took to bring down their opponent without causing permanent harm. If you managed to knock someone down and disable them, you'd quickly bind their hands and drag them off the battlefield. You'd then return to the fight, looking for your next capture. The battle would continue until one side had clearly gained the upper hand, usually measured by the number of captives taken. Then both sides would withdraw, gather their prisoners, and return home. Here's something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Flower Wars. They weren't friendly sparring matches. People absolutely got hurt. Warriors received serious injuries. Some didn't make it off the battlefield. The difference between Flower Wars and Conquest Wars wasn't that one was gentle and the other was harsh. The difference was in the objective. In a conquest war, the goal was to overwhelm the enemy completely, destroy their military capacity, occupy their territory. In a Flower War, the goal was to take captives and demonstrate martial prowess while maintaining the ongoing relationship between the participating states. The captives taken in Flower Wars faced a fate that's difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. They would be brought back to the capturing city, where they'd be treated with a strange mixture of honor and solemnity. They weren't treated as criminals or traitors. In fact, they were seen as fulfilling an important cosmic role. They'd be kept under guard, fed well, and prepared for their ultimate purpose in religious ceremonies. Let's get really specific about what happened after a battle, because this is where the complexity of the system becomes clear. When warriors returned to Tenochtitlan with their captives, there was a formal procession through the city. The capturing warriors would parade their prisoners through the streets, showing them off to the population. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about display, demonstrating the warriors' prowess, showing the gods that proper offerings were being provided, reinforcing the social order. The warrior who had captured the prisoner had specific responsibilities. He became, in a sense, the prisoner's sponsor or patron. He had to provide food, clothing, and shelter for his captive. This could last weeks or even months, depending on when the next major festival was scheduled. During this time, the captive would be treated relatively well. They'd be fed better than many commoners, given clean water, allowed to rest. Remember, they were seen as future offerings to the gods, so they needed to be in good condition. There were even ceremonies where the captor and the captive would engage in a kind of ritual kinship. The captor might refer to the captive as "my beloved son," and the captive would call the captor "my revered father." This language, which sounds bizarre to modern ears, reflected the religious significance of their relationship. The captor was responsible for bringing this person to the gods, and the captive was fulfilling a sacred duty. It wasn't a relationship of hatred or contempt. It was solemn and ritualistic. Here's something that really demonstrates how different this worldview was. The capturing warrior wouldn't actually participate in the final ceremony for his own captive. That would be done by priests and other officials. In fact, after the ceremony, the captor would often observe a period of mourning, painting himself with black paint and withdrawing from social activities for a time. There are accounts of captors weeping after their captives fulfilled their cosmic role. They'd say things like, "What if this had been me? What if I'd been captured instead?" There was this recognition that the roles could easily have been reversed. The body of the captive after the ceremony was treated with respect. Parts might be distributed to nobles or used in further rituals. The skull might be placed on the tzompantli, the skull rack, which sounds gruesome to us but was a place of honor in Aztec culture. These weren't trophies of conquest in our sense. They were monuments to those who had served the cosmic purpose. Now let's talk about the specific warrior culture that made the Flower Wars possible. Becoming a warrior in Aztec society was a path to advancement that was technically open to all but practically favored the nobility. Boys from noble families started their military education early, often in special schools called Kalmakak, where they received intensive training not just in warfare but in history, religion, astronomy, and leadership. Commoner boys attended the Tlaxcalans, which we mentioned earlier, where the focus was more on practical military skills and physical conditioning. But even commoners could rise through the ranks if they distinguished themselves in battle. The key metric was capturing enemies. Each capture was meticulously recorded and verified. You couldn't just claim to have captured someone. Witnesses had to confirm it, and there were severe penalties for false claims. The progression was clear and well-defined. Your first capture was a huge deal. It meant you'd proven yourself as a warrior. You'd get to cut your hair in a specific style and wear certain ornaments. Your second capture brought additional privileges. Your third capture elevated you further. 4 captures, and you could apply to join the elite warrior societies. It was like a rigid rank system, except instead of promotions being given by superiors, they were earned through specific achievements in battle. The elite warrior societies, the Jaguars, the Eagles, the Otomies, and others, weren't just military units. They were social clubs, religious fraternities, and political organizations, all rolled into one. They had their own meeting houses near the Templo Mayor. They had their own ceremonies and festivals. They had political influence and could advise the emperor on military and state matters. Membership in these societies was one of the primary ways that military success translated into political power and social status. Training for these societies was intense. Young warriors who had achieved the necessary captures would undergo initiation rites that tested their physical endurance, their courage, and their knowledge of military tactics and religious rituals. The initiations could last weeks and involve fasting, ritual baths, ceremonies, and tests of skill. Once you were accepted, you became part of a brotherhood that would last your entire life. The warrior societies maintained their own temples, where they'd conduct ceremonies honoring their patron deities. The Jaguar warriors worshipped Tezcatlipoca, the god of night, sorcery, and destiny. The Eagle warriors honored Huitzilopochtli, the sun god and patron deity of the Aztecs. These weren't casual religious affiliations. Being a member meant participating in regular ceremonies, making offerings, and maintaining a relationship with your society's god. Let's paint a picture of a typical young warrior's experience with the Flower Wars. Imagine you're 18 years old, you've completed your basic training, and this is your first real combat. You're not a noble. Your father is a skilled craftsman, which gives your family some status but not nobility. You've been training for years, but you've never captured an enemy. You need to prove yourself. You wake up before dawn on the day your unit is scheduled to depart for a flower war against the Tlaxcalans. You've barely slept because you're terrified and excited in equal measure. You put on your cotton armor, layer after layer of quilted cotton soaked in salt water and dried until it's rigid enough to deflect obsidian blades. It's heavy and hot, but it might save your life. You paint your face with the designs appropriate to your unit and your status. In your case, simple stripes since you're still unproven. You gather with your unit at the assembly point. There are maybe 50 young warriors like you, all first-timers, all nervous, all trying to look braver than they feel. The veterans are there too, the experienced warriors who've done this dozens of times. They're checking their weapons, adjusting their gear, joking around to ease the tension. They remember what it was like the first time. The march to the battlefield takes hours. You're walking along well-maintained roads, passing through towns and villages that are part of the Aztec Empire. People come out to watch you pass, offering food and water, calling out encouragement. You try to eat, but your stomach is in knots. The veterans keep up a steady stream of chatter, telling stories about previous flower wars, offering advice, making sure the newcomers don't psych themselves out. You reach the predetermined battlefield by mid-afternoon. The Tlaxcalans are already there, and the sight of them makes your heart race. They look fierce, painted and armed, shouting challenges across the field. Your commanders are conferring with their commanders, finalizing the details. There's a ritual to all of this. Priests performing ceremonies, offerings being made, drums beginning their rhythm. Then it's time. Your unit commander gives the signal, and you start forward with your fellow warriors. The Tlaxcalans are advancing too. The noise is overwhelming. Drums, conch shells, thousands of voices shouting. Your training takes over. You remember what you've been taught. Stay with your unit. Watch for opportunities. Go for captures, not glory. Protect your brothers. The lines meet, and it's chaos. You're trying to apply the techniques you've practiced, but everything's moving too fast. A Tlaxcalan warrior rushes at you, and you barely block his strike. Your Xochiyaoyotl connects with his shield, the obsidian blades biting into the wood. He's trying to grab you, to wrestle you down. You're doing the same to him. It's exhausting, terrifying, visceral. You fight this warrior for what feels like hours, but is probably only minutes. Neither of you can gain the advantage. Finally, other warriors intervene and you both disengage, looking for different opponents. You're breathing hard, your arms are aching, and you haven't captured anyone. Around you, more experienced warriors are succeeding where you failed. You see them subduing opponents, binding their hands, dragging them off the field. The battle continues for hours. You fight several different opponents, never quite managing to capture one. You take some hits, a crack on the shoulder that'll leave a nasty bruise, a scrape along your ribs where an obsidian blade got past your armor. Nothing serious, but enough to remind you this is real. By the time the commanders signal the end of the battle, you're exhausted, bruised, and disappointed. You didn't capture anyone. You didn't prove yourself. On the march back to Tenochtitlan, you're quiet, lost in your own thoughts. The veterans notice, but they don't mock you. Instead, they tell you about their first times, how it took them multiple battles to get their first capture, how everyone struggles at first. One veteran shows you the scars from his early battles and explains what he learned from each one. It's not comforting exactly, but it helps. You'll train harder. You'll learn. Next time will be different. That's what the Flower Wars were like for ordinary warriors. A constant process of training, fighting, learning, gradually accumulating the captures that would define your place in society. For every great hero who captured dozens of enemies, there were hundreds of young men grinding their way through the system, hoping to prove themselves, struggling to master the difficult art of subduing an opponent without causing permanent harm. The economic impact of the Flower Wars is something historians don't always emphasize, but it was significant. The warrior class had to be equipped, and that equipment was expensive. A full suit of cotton armor, the kind worn by elite warriors, required enormous amounts of cotton that had to be spun into thread, woven into cloth, quilted into layers, and treated to make it rigid. This was days or weeks of skilled labor. The featherwork for costumes and standards required feathers from tropical birds that had to be imported from distant regions through trade networks. The obsidian for weapons came from specific quarries and had to be worked by specialists who trained for years to master the craft. All of this created demand for goods and services, supporting a whole economic ecosystem of craftspeople, traders, and laborers. The tribute system that sustained the Aztec economy depended partly on having this constant military presence and activity to enforce it. The Flower Wars helped maintain military readiness, which in turn helped maintain the tribute system, which funded the military. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. The religious aspect of the Flower Wars also had economic dimensions. The major ceremonies required enormous amounts of resources: incense, decorations, food for the attendees, special clothing, and ornaments for the rituals. These ceremonies were major public events that brought people from across the empire to Tenochtitlan. They were like religious festivals, combined with state ceremonies, combined with sporting events. They boosted the capital's economy through what we'd now call religious tourism. There's also fascinating evidence about the psychological impact of the Flower Wars system. Spanish chroniclers recorded conversations with Aztec elders after the conquest, and some of these accounts provide insight into how people thought about the whole system. Some expressed pride in their martial culture and the religious significance of their warfare. Others seemed relieved that the system had ended, suggesting there was more ambivalence about it than the official ideology acknowledged. Archaeological evidence supports the documentary sources in interesting ways. Excavations at the Templo Mayor in Mexico City have uncovered thousands of offerings associated with ceremonies, including items that were almost certainly from captured warriors, clothing, weapons, ornaments from different city-states. The variety of these items shows that captives were coming from multiple different sources, supporting the historical accounts of widespread flower wars. Analysis of human remains from ceremonial contexts shows something interesting too. Many were young adult males in excellent physical condition, consistent with being warriors in their prime. The injuries visible on bones show evidence of healed fractures and other trauma, consistent with extensive combat training and experience. These weren't random victims. These were skilled fighters who'd survived numerous battles before being captured. There's also been interesting work on the iconography related to the Flower Wars. Aztec art frequently depicted warriors capturing enemies, and there are specific visual codes for showing different types of combat and different types of captives. In some representations, captives from Flower Wars are shown differently than captives from conquest wars, suggesting the Aztecs themselves recognized and visually distinguished between different types of warfare. The legacy of the warrior culture created by the Flower Wars persisted in interesting ways after the conquest. The Spanish recognized that Aztec warriors were formidable fighters, so they recruited them as auxiliary troops in their campaigns to conquer the rest of Mesoamerica and even in expeditions far from Mexico. The martial skills and organizational capacity developed through the Flower Wars system translated well to serving under Spanish command, at least initially. But the deeper psychological and cultural legacy took longer to process. The sudden end of the Flower Wars system, combined with the religious conversion enforced by the Spanish, created a kind of spiritual crisis. The entire worldview that had justified and explained the Flower Wars was being aggressively dismantled. The cosmic necessity that had made the system make sense was being declared false by the conquerors and their priests. Indigenous chronicles from the decades after the conquest show people struggling with this transition. Some embraced Christianity enthusiastically, perhaps partly because it offered a new framework for understanding the universe after the old one had been shattered. Others maintained traditional beliefs in secret, creating syncretic practices that blended Catholic and indigenous elements. The warrior class, which had derived its entire identity and status from the old system, faced a particularly difficult adjustment. Understanding the Flower Wars requires grappling with fundamental questions about cultural relativism and historical judgment. Can we understand and explain a practice without endorsing it? Can we recognize the internal logic and coherence of a belief system while still maintaining that some of its consequences were harmful? These aren't just academic questions. They're relevant to how we think about cultural difference and moral judgment in the present day. The Flower Wars also raise questions about the nature of warfare itself. We tend to think of war as having certain inherent characteristics, that it's about defeating enemies, taking territory, securing resources. But the Flower Wars show that warfare can serve completely different purposes when embedded in different cultural and religious frameworks. They challenge our assumptions about what war is and what it's for. There's also something to be said about the sheer human ingenuity involved in the Flower Wars system. Whatever we think of the purposes it served, creating a formalized system of ritualized warfare that multiple independent city-states agreed to participate in for decades shows sophisticated diplomatic and organizational capacity. It required trust, or at least mutual understanding of self-interest, among parties who were also enemies. That's not simple. The ceremonies themselves were massive public events. They'd take place at the top of the Great Pyramids, in front of thousands of spectators. The city would gather to witness these rituals, which were seen as essential to maintaining the cosmos. The captured warriors would be dressed in elaborate costumes, painted with specific colors, and treated with ritual respect. They were told they were going to the gods, that they were fulfilling the highest possible purpose, that they would be honored in the afterlife. And here's something that modern historians have documented, but that sounds almost unbelievable. Some captives apparently accepted their fate willingly. There are accounts of captured warriors taking pride in being chosen for this role. This seems insane to us, but remember the religious context. These societies genuinely believed that this was necessary to keep the sun rising and the world functioning. To be chosen for this role was, in their worldview, a great honor that guaranteed you a place in the most prestigious afterlife. Not all captives ended up in ceremonies immediately. Some were kept for years, living in a kind of honored captivity. They might be brought out for specific festivals, dressed in the regalia of gods, and paraded through the city. The most famous example is the ceremony of Tlaxcalans, where a young, handsome captive would be chosen to represent the god Tezcatlipoca. For an entire year, this person would live as the god's embodiment, treated with reverence, given fine clothes and food, taught to play the flute, and married to 4 beautiful women who represented goddesses. At the end of the year, during the festival of Tlaxcalans, he would climb the pyramid to fulfill his divine role. The scale of these ceremonies could be enormous. Spanish chroniclers reported seeing thousands of people involved in major festivals. The Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid at the center of Tenochtitlan, was the primary site, but ceremonies also took place at other temples throughout the city. The largest recorded ceremony supposedly happened in 1487, when the Templo Mayor was reconsecrated after expansion. The numbers reported by Spanish sources for that event are controversial and probably exaggerated, but even conservative estimates suggest it was a massive undertaking involving captives from across the empire. Now let's talk about the Tlaxcalans specifically, because they're fascinating and their relationship with the Aztecs is way more complex than simple enemies. Tlaxcala was a confederation of 4 city-states located in a mountainous region east of the Aztec capital. They were completely surrounded by Aztec territory or by states allied with the Aztecs, yet they maintained their independence for decades. How did they do this? Part of it was their military prowess. The Tlaxcalans were fierce warriors, and attacking them in their mountain territory would have been costly for the Aztecs. But the bigger part was the Flower Wars system. By participating in these ritualized conflicts, the Tlaxcalans maintained their autonomy while fulfilling the religious requirements that both societies believed in. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, at least from a certain perspective. The Aztecs even placed an economic blockade on Tlaxcala, preventing them from getting salt, cotton, and other trade goods. This made life harder for the Tlaxcalans, but it also created a situation where they were constantly ready for conflict, always on a war footing, which made them excellent opponents for the Flower Wars. The Aztecs could have easily ended this blockade, but they chose to maintain it because it kept the Tlaxcalans as viable adversaries. There's a theory among some historians that the Aztecs deliberately kept Tlaxcala independent as a kind of enemy preserve. They wanted to have a nearby opponent for the Flower Wars, and conquering Tlaxcala completely would have eliminated that. It's like maintaining a rival team in a league. You need them to keep playing the game. This theory is debated, but there's decent evidence for it. The Aztecs certainly had the military capacity to conquer Tlaxcala if they'd made it a priority, but they never did. The Flower Wars also served important social and political functions beyond just providing captives. They kept the military establishment busy and focused during times of relative peace. In any warrior culture, you've got a problem when there aren't enough wars to fight. Warriors get restless. They start looking for other outlets for their aggression. They might even challenge the political leadership. The Flower Wars gave warriors a regular outlet for their martial skills and ambitions. They also served as a training ground for young warriors. If you were a young man from a noble family or aspiring to military glory, you needed combat experience to prove yourself. But if all the nearby enemies had been conquered and there were no big campaigns happening, how would you get that experience? The Flower Wars provided a solution. They were like a combination of military training exercise and real combat, allowing young warriors to prove their courage and skill in an actual battle situation. The political elite used the Flower Wars to reinforce social hierarchies too. Success in these battles brought rewards and status, but only if you were already in a position to participate. Commoners could sometimes become warriors, but it was much easier if you came from a noble family with connections and resources. The Flower Wars helped maintain class distinctions by providing opportunities for advancement that were theoretically open to everyone, but practically advantaged those who already had privilege. There's also an interesting diplomatic aspect to the Flower Wars. When the Aztecs wanted to intimidate other city-states or demonstrate their power, they could point to their success in these ritualized conflicts. If a city-state was considering rebellion or resisting Aztec demands, Aztec ambassadors could basically say, "Look at how many warriors we capture from Tlaxcala and Huexotzingo. Those are some of the best fighters in the region, and we dominate them in the Flower Wars. You really want to fight us for real?" It was a way of displaying military prowess without actually launching conquest campaigns. Now let's address some common misconceptions about the Flower Wars, because there's a lot of confusion and misinformation out there. First, the Flower Wars weren't the only type of warfare the Aztecs engaged in. They absolutely fought conquest wars, expansion campaigns, and punitive expeditions against rebellious cities. The Flower Wars were just one type of military activity among many. When the Aztecs wanted to conquer new territory, They fought regular wars with all the brutality that entails. Second, the Flower Wars weren't friendly or safe. This wasn't like modern war games or military exercises. Real harm happened to real people. The difference was in the objective and the rules of engagement, not in the danger level. Third, not all captives taken in Flower Wars immediately faced ceremonial fates. Some became slaves in the traditional sense, working in households or on construction projects. Some were kept as hostages to ensure their home city's cooperation. The large ceremonial events that everyone focuses on were actually relatively rare, reserved for major festivals and special occasions. Fourth, the religious justification for the Flower Wars was genuine. It's easy for modern people to dismiss the religious explanations as propaganda covering up more practical motivations. And yes, there were practical benefits to the system. But the Aztecs really believed in their cosmology. They genuinely thought they were maintaining the universe through their actions. We have to take that seriously to understand them properly. Fifth, the Flower Wars were not unique to the Aztecs. Other Mesoamerican cultures engaged in ritualized warfare with similar purposes. The Maya had comparable practices centuries earlier. The Aztecs just formalized and systematized it to a degree we have detailed records of. Let's talk about how the Flower Wars fit into the broader Aztec military system, because that context is important. The Aztec military was incredibly organized and sophisticated. They had a professional officer corps, military schools called Tlaxcalans, where young men trained, specialized warrior orders with specific roles, and a clear hierarchy of ranks and honors. Military service was mandatory for all young men, regardless of class. At around 15 years old, boys would enter the Tlaxcalans, where they'd receive military training, education in history and religion, and preparation for adult life. The training was harsh and demanding. They'd learn weapons use, battle tactics, physical conditioning, and the mental discipline needed for combat. The military orders were like special forces. The two most famous were the Jaguar Warriors and the Eagle Warriors, but there were others too. These orders had their own regalia, their own temples, their own ceremonies. Membership was restricted to warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle by taking multiple captives. Being inducted into one of these orders was a major achievement that brought social status, material rewards, and political influence. The Aztec military strategy was generally sophisticated. They used scouts and spies extensively. They had a system of relay runners who could carry messages quickly across long distances. They built and maintained roads to move troops efficiently. They had supply systems to keep armies fed during campaigns. They used psychological warfare, intimidation, and diplomatic pressure as much as actual combat. When the Aztecs conquered a new territory, they typically didn't occupy it with troops or replace the local rulers. Instead, they'd install the existing leadership as vassals, require tribute payments, and expect military support when called upon. This allowed them to control a vast territory with a relatively small administrative apparatus. But it also meant they had to regularly demonstrate their military power to keep subject states in line, which was another function of the Flower Wars. The tribute system was crucial to the Aztec economy. Conquered cities and regions had to send regular shipments of goods to Tenochtitlan: corn, beans, cacao, textiles, precious feathers, jade, gold, and more. The Aztecs kept detailed records of tribute obligations in books called codices. These weren't tribute in the sense of voluntary gifts. This was taxation backed by military force. Cities that didn't pay tribute faced punitive campaigns. Now here's something interesting, and the Flower Wars actually became a liability when the Spanish showed up in 1519. The Tlaxcalans, who had been the Aztecs' regular opponents in the Flower Wars for decades, still harbored deep resentment about the economic blockade and the constant pressure from the Aztec Empire. When Hernan Cortés and his conquistadors arrived and were looking for allies against the Aztecs, guess who jumped at the opportunity? The Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans initially fought against the Spanish, but after some battles demonstrated Spanish military technology and tactics, the Tlaxcalan leadership made a calculated decision. They allied with Cortés, providing thousands of warriors who knew Aztec tactics inside and out. The Tlaxcalan contribution to the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire was absolutely crucial. Without Tlaxcalan warriors, guides, and support, Cortés probably wouldn't have succeeded. This is one of history's great ironies. The Aztecs had deliberately maintained Tlaxcala as an independent rival for the Flower Wars, and that decision came back to haunt them in the worst possible way. If they'd conquered Tlaxcala decades earlier, there wouldn't have been this powerful, resentful neighbor ready to ally with Spanish invaders. The Flower Wars system, which had seemed so clever and beneficial, turned out to have a catastrophic downside. The Spanish were absolutely shocked and horrified by the religious ceremonies they witnessed. Spanish chroniclers wrote extensively about them, though their accounts are problematic because they were written from a European Catholic perspective that saw these practices as demonic and barbaric. The Spanish used these practices as justification for conquest, arguing they were saving souls and eliminating evil. But here's what often gets lost. The Spanish themselves were not strangers to public displays involving harm. The Spanish Inquisition was in full swing during this period. Public punishments were common in Europe. What really shocked the Spanish was the scale, the religious justification, and the fact that the victims were often honored warriors rather than criminals or heretics. It wasn't the fact of ritualized endings that shocked them. It was the cultural context and the way it was integrated into the entire social and religious system. After the conquest, Spanish priests worked aggressively to eliminate all traces of Aztec religion. They destroyed temples, burned codices, and punished people caught practicing old rituals. The Flower Wars system obviously ended completely. The entire worldview that had sustained it was attacked and suppressed. Within a generation, the sophisticated military culture of the Aztecs was largely dismantled, but some aspects survived in interesting ways. The martial values, the emphasis on courage and honor, the pride in military achievement, these attitudes persisted in Mexican culture even as the specific practices changed. Modern Mexican culture has a complicated relationship with its Aztec heritage, sometimes celebrating it, sometimes uncomfortable with certain aspects of it, but definitely recognizing it as a foundational part of national identity. Historians and anthropologists continue to debate various aspects of the Flower Wars. How common were they really? How much of what the Spanish chroniclers reported was accurate versus exaggerated or misunderstood? What were the real motivations behind them? Were they primarily religious, primarily practical, or some complex mixture? Recent scholarship has emphasized the agency of all the participants. For a long time, the narrative was that the Aztecs imposed this system on unwilling neighbors, but more nuanced analysis suggests that city-states like Tlaxcala chose to participate because it served their interests too. They got to maintain independence, capture their own prisoners for religious ceremonies, and keep their warrior culture vibrant. It was a system that, bizarre as it seems to us, made sense within its own context. The Flower Wars represent something that's hard for modern minds to grasp, a form of organized conflict that wasn't primarily about material gain or territorial expansion. The Aztecs weren't trying to take land or resources in these battles. They had a different set of objectives rooted in their cosmological beliefs and their understanding of humanity's relationship with the divine. Compare this to most warfare throughout history. Usually, wars are fought for pretty straightforward reasons. One side wants what the other side has, whether that's land, resources, trade routes, political power, or security. Even religious wars usually have underlying material motivations, But the Flower Wars really do seem to have been primarily about maintaining cosmic order through the capture of prisoners for ceremonies. That doesn't mean there weren't secondary benefits, the political advantages, the military training aspect, the social status system. All of that mattered. But the core justification and the primary driver really does seem to have been religious. The Aztecs thought they were preventing the end of the world. Everything else flowed from that belief. Understanding the Flower Wars requires understanding a fundamentally different worldview. The Aztecs didn't separate religion, politics, warfare, and daily life into distinct categories the way we do. Everything was interconnected. The cosmos, the gods, humanity, nature, society. It was all one integrated system. Your actions as a warrior weren't just about personal glory or your city's power. They were about maintaining the balance of the universe. This is why the captives weren't seen as victims in the modern sense. They were fulfilling an essential role in the cosmic drama. They were allowing the sun to continue rising, the rain to fall, the crops to grow. In the Aztec worldview, this wasn't tragedy. It was necessity, even nobility. Modern readers often struggle with this because we're so far removed from that way of thinking. We separate the secular from the sacred. We think of warfare as a political or economic activity, not a religious one. We see individual human life as having intrinsic value independent of cosmic or religious considerations. The Aztecs thought differently on all these points. This isn't to say the Aztec system was good or right by our standards. It obviously wasn't. But understanding it on its own terms, rather than just dismissing it as barbaric, gives us insight into the incredible diversity of human cultures and belief systems. It shows us that people can create elaborate, internally consistent worldviews that look completely alien from the outside, but make perfect sense from the inside. The legacy of the Flower Wars in Mexican history and culture is complicated. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, Mexican nationalists often downplayed the more disturbing aspects of Aztec culture, preferring to emphasize their architectural achievements, their sophisticated society, and their resistance to Spanish conquest. The Flower Wars and religious ceremonies were either ignored or explained away as Spanish propaganda. More recently, there's been a move toward a more honest engagement with all aspects of Aztec culture, including the difficult parts. Modern Mexicans can take pride in their indigenous heritage, while also acknowledging that some practices were genuinely disturbing. It's possible to recognize the Aztecs as a sophisticated, powerful civilization, while also understanding that their religious practices involved things we now find unacceptable. The Flower Wars also raise interesting questions for anthropologists and historians about how to study and discuss cultures very different from our own. Do we judge past societies by modern ethical standards? Or do we try to understand them entirely within their own context? Most scholars now try to walk a middle path, understanding the culture on its own terms, recognizing the internal logic of their belief systems, but also being willing to make ethical judgments where appropriate. What can we learn from the Flower Wars today? Well, they're a reminder that human societies can organize themselves in wildly different ways based on fundamentally different assumptions about reality. They show us that warfare isn't always about the reasons we assume: territory, resources, security. Sometimes it serves other purposes entirely. They demonstrate how deeply religion can be integrated into every aspect of society, including military activities. They're also a cautionary tale about unintended consequences. The Aztecs created the Flower Wars system to solve specific problems, and it worked for their purposes for decades. But maintaining Tlaxcala as an independent rival, which seemed so clever, turned out to be a fatal mistake when the Spanish arrived. Strategic decisions that make sense in one context can become catastrophic liabilities when circumstances change. The Flower Wars represent one of the most unique and fascinating aspects of Mesoamerican history. They were wars fought not for conquest, not for plunder, but for captives to fulfill religious obligations. They were formalized, ritualized conflicts where both sides knew the rules and generally followed them. They served multiple purposes: religious, social, political, military, all at once. To the Aztecs and their contemporaries, the Flower Wars made perfect sense. They were maintaining cosmic order, keeping their warriors sharp, reinforcing social hierarchies, and demonstrating power. To outside observers, both Spanish conquistadors then and modern students of history now, they seem bizarre and disturbing. But that gap in understanding is itself valuable. It reminds us how differently humans can think, how varied our cultures and beliefs can be. The Flower Wars ended with the Spanish conquest, but their memory persists. They're studied by historians, taught in schools, referenced in discussions of Aztec culture. They've become a symbol of how alien and sophisticated pre-Columbian American civilizations were. They challenge our assumptions about warfare, religion, and human nature. So the next time you hear someone talk about ancient warfare, as if all wars throughout history were basically the same, fought for land, resources, and power, remember the Flower Wars. Remember that the Aztecs and their neighbors created a system of conflict that served completely different purposes, rooted in a worldview so different from ours that it's hard to fully comprehend. That's the power of history. It shows us just how diverse human experience has been, and maybe, in understanding that diversity, we learn something about ourselves too.